right, so I did a presentation for Morris Arboretum. It's funny, their speaker, who normally does it, wasn't able to do it. So like, could you do something similar? I was like, yeah. So it was gardening for songbirds, and so but the audience for that was gardeners, right? So I was thinking, what about birders? Like how do you landscape for birders, right? Like people who aren't necessarily interested in plants, like already, or that knowledgeable about plants, but also from the perspective of observing birds rather as the focus rather than benefiting birds. Obviously, as birders, we probably want to benefit birds as a focus, but let's face it, we're trying to see birds, right? So that's a little bit of a different perspective, right? And I just want to like lean into that and accept that that might be one of the main outcomes that someone wants is to observe birds. So I figured let's kind of look at it from that perspective. And also what I love about DVOC is that the audience is, a pretty high level of science and, ecology literacy. So you don't have to as a scientist, you can make a presentation fairly science dense. Not to sound elitist, but you know what I'm saying? Like there's we know the crowd we're dealing with. So I felt like I would put some ecology in this as well. That I think helps give context and to what to how this works. When you are thinking about what you can attract to your yard, your yard is not it's not on its own. It fits into an overall landscape, and it has connections to other pieces of habitat and other yards in different ways. So that plays into it as well. So I'm gonna lean to that. But again, this was sooner than I expected. So hopefully this is coherent for something that wasn't as polished as I would like. But let's get into it. So all right, so our goal is the ecology of residential landscaping for birders. So just a little bit about my background. I'm from Philly, born and raised, from the lower Northeast. So I grew up having the first house up until I was 12, had just a cement paver kind of backyard with, basically no greenery in it. And then I moved to Mayfair where, again, row houses, rather than a backyard, the back of the house has a garage. You could drive your car in, but our houses are so small, no one uses it as a garage because you need more space. So the back of the house is just a place to park a car. So, I grew up basically having very little area to landscape other than like your tiny front lawn that would take longer to walk your mower around the house to the front than it would have taken to mow it. It would literally, Lynn knows what I'm talking about. So then I moved to West Philly and South Philly. Spent about 22 years there, but I was rentals. Eventually I kind of get fed up and start putting plants and native plants into the small backyards there, whether or not, those plants would persist or that I moved out or not, but I still felt like doing it. I started doing bird walks. I did field work in Canada, Arctic Canada, Alaska, Peru, Brazil. Then decided I had to go back to school. And at this point I was like, well, I'm not going to learn, you're lucky if you can get an ornithology class in undergrad. You can't get a degree in ornithology, you get a degree in something else, in the science related, environmental science or biology, and then study birds and you're an ornithologist, but you don't actually get a degree in birds. And I thought maybe as it went to Temple for environmental studies, didn't like it. I was like, so I took a plant ecology class because I need to know more about plants, and that changed my world. And I've handled birds in field work. I don't particularly like it. There's always, I'm not I used to be vegan. I'm not a vegan anymore. So it's not, but I still don't like harming birds. And even though the benefits of scientific research outweigh the cost of mortality, but there is always a chance of mortality when you handle birds, as tedious as. So I was like, I want to benefit birds and study birds and not have to actually like misnet them and put bans on them. And that was fun, so I can get to remote places, but it was not really what I want to do as a career. So I thought that I would learn how to manage habitat to benefit birds. If you think about that, if you're going to, and this is how it translates to yards, if you want everything's plants. I mean, I know geologists will say, well, it's the bedrock, it begets the soil, and some people might say, well, it's climate. But ultimately, the thing that you could really affect to benefit birds is plants, right? Think about, a willow flycatcher, right? They called it willow flycatcher for a reason. It's a bird that's extremely, very abundant out here in the right conditions, but it's an endangered species in the Southwest because the habitat, willow is a water-loving tree, a shrub, so the habitat that can support that is very limited, as you can imagine, because water. So this is just, everything starts with the plants. Even if a bird doesn't eat plants, it eats the insects that eat the plants, or it eats something that eats insects that eats plants. So plants, and a lot of birds require specific structure. So we'll get into that. So that's what kind of changed my career path to really focus on plants. Although along the way, to make money to go to school, I went to school later in life. I started working in as a naturalist, do natural history interpretation. Environmental education is what it's been called now. I wish it would still be called being a naturalist. So that's what I ended up having my career in. So I'm kind of in the public facing part of that, but I still do a lot of hands-on stuff with managing land, and a lot of tree planting, a lot of education around that. So it's still very much part of my life and career, but I'm more of a public program side of things. So anyway, so now I live in Roxborough, and I have in my mind, I have a big yard. I live in a single house, so I have a yard in every direction, and I've done a whole lot of personal landscaping for that. Plus, I've been working with Parks and Rec for 8 years, where I have an influence on. I'm part of a team that we manage 6,000 acres of natural lands in over a 10,000 acre system. So that's kind of my background and kind of how birding and plants relate to me. So let's talk about how it relates to you. All right, so let's talk about this. Is this for birds or birders, right? Now, obviously, we want to benefit birds, but it's going to be a slide here in a minute. I'm trying to remember that we'll show you that no matter what if you have a yard, you're going to have some birds in it, right? So if this is about benefiting birds, well, we got to talk about what birds you want, right? So I don't think people just want to have a yard that's, if you want birds in it, well, you don't have to do much. You're going to get, house sparrows and starlings in it. I think we're talking about you want to increase the opportunity to see birds that are more interesting, and also to benefit birds that are could use a hand, that are not as abundant as should be for various reasons. I think that's what we're talking about here. I think that's the two goals birders want: to see more birds, but to see also to benefit birds, especially ones that are in trouble. Right. So let's talk about again your priorities. Are your priorities opportunities for right. So I listed the priorities. All right. So your order priorities. Do you want to provide resources for nesting birds, right? And here we have a catbird. Do you want to provide resources for migrating birds? Do you want to observe more birds in your yard, or do you want to observe more birds from your yard, right? I don't really have any more slides about observing more birds from your yard, because the main thing to do is basically don't obscure your view of the sky. If you want to, that's the best way, or put an antenna to get night calls from your yard. Then that's basically the thing to do. If you want to, obviously maybe build a deck or a platform, all right? But again, so yardless. So we're talking to birders. That like when you can count on your yard list, it's not just what birds are actually physically in your yard, or even in the airspace over your yard, but actually what you observe from your yard. So I have bald eagle and broad-winged hawk from my, and a lot of species like nighthawk and whatnot from my yard. They were obviously not have anything to do with my yard. They just happen to be, I've seen, not even over. I've seen them, flying over. I live right next to Wissahickon. I've seen them like flying over. But a lot of people, so that could be something, you want to lean into and really make sure that you don't diminish your opportunities by planting habitat that birds would love to live in, but would obscure your view of the sky. So that's something to consider. And then here's one, this is something that a lot of birders like. It's not necessarily going to benefit birds, their populations, but it's a lot of fun. You can do things to attract rare and unusual birds to your yard, and we'll talk about that, right? And so, the example here is a common redpoll, and we'll talk about it more, but that's like the classic, right? I think a lot of us are hoping to attract. We know that we have these eruptions of boreal forest species, and so that is something we'll talk about a little bit that you might be able to do with your plants in your yard. So let's talk about scale. So ecology really starts with scale. And as someone who grew up in a row home, I want people to feel like this information applies to them, not just if you have a big suburban yard, right? In fact, if anything, I probably could have put way more information about bigger, residential spaces. I'm just frankly not that familiar with it. I kind of go from like, even having a single home for me is new. So I kind of go from like, my worlds are like in my yard, which now has to be single home with like even small spaces, to like helping being a part of the Parks and Rec where we have 10,000 acres to deal with. So like the in between is a little bit, I don't have as much experience with, but I do, a lot of these ecological principles can apply to that. But also, I guess I didn't have a line here, but I'm going to have information here about how, even if you live in an apartment, that you can affect your landscaping, management via the institution, via the apartment complex, your condo association. We'll talk about that more, but that is you can make a lot of impact there. The other thing is you can also influence like park management. In Parks and Rec, honestly, a lot of for instance, Pastures Park in Chestnut Hill has some phenomenal habitat for birds, even though it's in a residential neighborhood. And it's because the park advocacy group there, they understand that birds need certain structure, or wildlife need things besides just shade trees, and they've planted appropriate habitat, and the bird populations reflect that. And so you can make big inroads, and we're going to talk about that a lot. I'm going to talk incessantly about shrubs in a minute, so bear with me. All right, so we got to kind of temper expectations, right? So we got to think about what birds actually breed in Philadelphia, right? So for benefit breeding birds, we got to talk about who's actually here, who moves through here, talking about migrating birds, right? What are the habitat requirements of the breeding species, right? What's the size of their territory, their ecosystem, the structure and the plant community, right? Some things to keep in mind about, and the point when I say tempering expectations is that a lot of these species, you can't, in a residential area, you cannot affect the scale that these species require. So we kind of got to accept that we're not going to attract these birds to your yard because you just don't have the space to work with, right? So here's the slide. There's pretty much nothing if you want birds in your yard, well, these three species are going to be there, right? We know that house sparrows, house finches, and starlings are going to be there. So, well, if you want birds, and you're not picky about what birds you have, you don't need to do much. They're going to be there, right? But I think we want some other species. I left this in from the Morris presentation. We all know about eBird, but hopefully you do know about the bar charts where you can choose your region and get pretty specific. I think you can even do this for your own yard, but you can see what species are have been observed in your area, and you can look, and there's a chart and it shows you the frequency, the thicker, I guess taller the bar, the more sightings there are. So you can really get a sense of what birds are there and when, and especially migrating birds, you can see where the peaks are, right? So this is things to consider about. It's great information, especially for breeding birds, what birds are going to be here. But if you're going after migrating birds, especially if those birds have a relationship with plants that have timing of fruit, this is important information to know, right? So your eBird bar charts are important to help you in that respect. This is the breeding bird survey that I helped with, along with Matt Halley and 70 other, probably many of you are here. We've been doing this every couple of years. So this is just for Philadelphia. There is the Pennsylvania Atlas. It's due for a new one soon, right? It's been, well, I think was it every 20 years, is it? It's been a while.
We're starting the new one.
Right, yeah, so that's a wealth of information, but things have changed a lot. So this gives you a sense, the Atlas, as well as what we've done, as well as eBird, gives you some information about what birds are here and where, so you can kind of know but I think as birders, we know this, but if you're new to birding, you're not, birding, these are some resources that can help you here. Also, if you want to know about birds, and field guides don't give you nearly enough information about their resources they need in terms of like very specific habitat requirements, right? They generally don't give you that. And often they'll talk about what they eat, but not specific enough, especially if it's plants. So kind of just like berries or seeds. But so the Birds of the World is a great resource, well worth the $50 a year. I need to renew, but It's well worth it. You want to go old school, the Birders Handbook is actually really, especially for information about timing and breeding and some more information than you get out of a field guide. This is an old book that you could buy for $5 on like Amazon or eBay, and it's a pretty good resource. All right, so let's talk about some ecology here. So, I don't know if you're all familiar with the theory of island biogeography, right? So island biology, we're going to define it in a minute, but how's it plays into what we're talking about here? You're like, why talk about islands? Well, think about islands not necessarily as like surrounded by water, but thinking about islands as, think about the Sky Islands. I know Bert was just there, right? So Sky Islands are these, the northern terminus of the Sierra Madres in Mexico, where it's not water, it's arid Sonoran desert that separates the forest on the altitude that gets enough moisture to have forest, right? So you get these more like subtropical Mexican forests, like out into the southern United States in Arizona. So those are islands, right? And those species, birds can move from island to island because they're very mobile, but plants and reptiles don't have the same mobility. So it affects their what is left on those islands. And so that's true for islands that are actually in the water, and it's true for islands that are like the forest during the glacial maxima. The forest in the Sky Islands was actually much lower in elevation, so they were connected and then it receded. So essentially populations of animals and of organisms get isolated on islands, and the ability to repopulate is impacted by how close you are to the bigger patch of habitat and the size of the island. And you're like, well, why does this have to do with yards? Well, your yard's distance from a big park is actually really important to think about how you can impact bird populations, right? So let's, E.O. Wilson was one of the founders of this theory of island biogeography, and the idea that plants and animal species on an island is related to area and it's isolation, right? So smaller, more isolated islands have fewer number of plants and animals, and the bigger have, and closer to mainland have more. This is the basic principles. Now, if only somebody we knew might have actually been involved with this and took it further. So there was this project in Brazil where they actually knew that there's going to be, it's just north of Manaus, the city about the size of Philadelphia in the Brazilian Amazon. And they knew that they were going to develop the land into cattle ranches. So the scientists there actually asked if they would leave certain sizes of patches of forest and cut it and leave certain sizes of it in certain distances from the contiguous forest that was left. And then they studied the plant and animal communities there over time to see how it changed, right? So this is what it was there, and this is what it became, and you can see like these different sizes, right? And they came up with this concept called SLOS, single large or several small. And the idea is what's better, right? If you want to preserve habitat and benefit a number of species, is it better to have one really large park or several small parks, right? And that was like their theory. Now, look at this hunk here in the middle there. This tall, handsome devil there. I know, I'm sorry putting the thirst trap in the middle of this presentation, but that's our Rob Rearguard. And he was one of the people involved in this project. So I knew, and it's funny, when I was, I had island biogeography in my other presentation. So it's not just to plant people that don't know Rob. So don't think I just did this just to put this picture of Rob looking like a total babe in here. Not that he's still not a total babe, but I just think it's kind of awesome that like someone from our own club is help contribute to this, as well as all these amazing Brazilian biologists. In fact, when I was in Brazil, I did a semester there because when I went back to school, I got bored quick and decided to have to do a semester in Brazil. I actually interned for a month with Augusto Piratelli, who was part of that project and knew Rob. So it's crazy. And what I studied with him was actually bird populations, comparing We're actually doing like seed dispersal in pastures that were like we're doing work with seed dispersal via like frugivorous birds, and also comparing like forest edge, interior forest, and like orchard population. So he was still very much in that world. So okay, let's talk about edge effect, which is also an ecological concept that comes out of island biogeography. So the biggest example is when you put a road through a piece of habitat, you now you've made two islands, right? And animals, a lot of animals, believe it or not, do not want to cross a road. Even birds that can fly, especially in tropics, but a lot of these birds do not like to be out in the open at all. But you'd be surprised how a road could be a barrier for birds. And the other thing is interior. Think about a wood thrush, an interior forest species. Once you put a road, once you clear, a power line, you name it, you put that line through that habitat. Wood thrush are no longer going to be. You diminish their habitat more than you think. Even if you're like, well, it's just one road through it. But now you've brought light into that ecosystem, and it goes into the forest wider than you would think, right? So these interior forest species don't want to be near where it's light, because the plant community has changed. What they feed on isn't there. Their search image is different because of lighting conditions, you name it, predators. So now they're going to be further away. So you've significantly reduced the habitat. And so it can eventually make it such that there's no, it's too small. It's all edge, right? But with that said, we know that there's a lot of bird species that like edge, right? Indigo buntings, bob thrashers. So that's something to consider, right? So don't worry, it's going to circle back to your yards in a minute, right? Again, fragmentation, right? The animal communities change dramatically by fragmenting, right? So, all right, so let's talk about some birds and how you might be able to impact them, but also temper your expectations. All right. Now, I think we're birders. We know what bluebirds and what they need. So you're probably not guilty of putting up a bluebird box in your house, outside your house, because you're not going to get a bluebird. But a lot of people think that you could put up a bluebird house and get a bluebird, right? So do you have bluebirds need 12 acres per pair, right? Not 12 acres, not if you have 12 acres of a meadow, you're going to get a bluebird. No, so you need more bluebirds than just a pair, right? Because they got to, you got to have an area big enough to have many bluebirds so they can meet and attract each other, right? So you're talking 12 acres minimum for one pair. So who has, we're talking dozens of acres of habitat, and we know bluebirds are not forest species. They are savanna, edge, grassland, farmland species, right? So, so likelihood you attracting bluebirds to your property is very unlikely. However, do you live next to a golf course? Do you live next to an airport? Do you live next to an open area, right? And if the answer is yes, right? If you happen to live next to a farm or a golf course, and some of us probably do, if you actually maintain your chances are, if you live next to a golf course or a farm, you might have a bigger property, right? Because you're semi-rural, right? Some of us probably live farther out in the city, and you might actually have that kind of land to work with, maybe an acre or two. Well, if you plant your yard in natural vegetation and don't forest it because the species doesn't want to be in a forest, you might actually get bluebirds to use your property, right? So that's what I'm getting at, is don't think about your yard as just on its own. Think about what your yard is next to and adjacent to or nearby, and you might actually you can work with that and lean into that habitat that you have in in the larger patch and actually contribute to make that habitat bigger, right? And also in the case of bluebirds, now they might not find enough food, and we do know that they do breed in sometimes golf courses and whatnot, but like that's not the biomass of the turf grass for a golf course is probably not supporting ideally the population of insects that they would like. So, but if you make your yard into natural, native grasses and forbs, you're probably producing a lot more insects that they can eat. So you can actually help the population. You might actually make an impact. So something to think about. So I'm sure we all know this. Like Marty was literally talking about looking down at the Kentucky, looking down at the Bicknells, right? And then someone's looking up at the worming, which worming's kind of more like mid-story. But we know that like different birds, they tend to forage within specific strata within a forest, right? And they tend to sing. We all know. I mean, where are you going to see a great as a flycatcher? Like, are you going to look up, or are you going to look down, or look what? Where do you find great as a flycatcher? How high in a tree? You can tell me. Right. So, where are you going to find a towhee? Right. So we all know this, but a lot of people don't know this, right? And so we have to get this through to people that shade trees are only gonna, affect birds in canopy, right? So we're gonna show that and demonstrate in a minute. This is a big presentation. So I don't want to like go forever, but I have a lot of information here to. All right. Talk about shrubs. Shrubs are underutilized in residential and commercial landscaping. Okay. People rarely plant shrubs in Olmsted manicured type parks and cemeteries, right? And when they do plant shrubs, they rarely plant them densely enough, right? Think about that. We'll throw it back. Don't worry. We're going to drill shrubs into your head. So, sorry. I guess this is out of order real quick, but this is from the bluebird, right? This is the map of a bluebird in breeding season, right? And this is in Northwest. This is the border between Northwest Philadelphia, right? And like Lafayette Hill. And you can see this is eBird map. You can see where are you seeing bluebirds in the breeding season? You're only seeing them at golf courses, Morris Arboretum, Houston Meadow, Endora Meadow, and the meadows at Schuylkill Center, right? Even when they have like there might be a pin for the Wissahickon, it seems like it's not in the Wissahickon, it's not in the meadow. That's just because somebody chose the Wissahickon as this location for that. Not you can see how specific bluebirds are, right? They all want these that open habitat, right? So I think there's like there's one or two records that I saw that might be in a residential area, but they're next to a golf course or something, right? So, okay, wood thrush. Now, think about forests, grassland habitat. Bluebirds are not exactly grassland species. They do like grassland, but they kind of like savanna-y, kind of, more open. But there are a little bit of structure. But think about especially think about grassland birds. Their habitat is almost like 2D, right? While the biomass in a forest has a lot of vertical structure. So you actually there's a lot more biomass and therefore a lot more insects in a smaller area. So forest species tend to have smaller ranges, but still, you're talking about a wood thrush. A pair of wood thrush have a 4-acre territory, right? So, who has 4 acres, especially, and that's again, it's not 4 acres. That's 4 acres of interior forest, right? And it's obviously you don't just want one, So even if you had 4 acres of unless to work with, unless it was within a forest, right? Like you're filling in 4 acres that were open, you're not going to make more wood thrush habitat. However, if you live next to a park, right? I happen to live almost right next to the Wissahickon. So I'm a third house in. In fact, I had to look at a landlines on a map actually. My backyard, I was like where the houses are because we're in a row. We're in a straight street, but the street behind us is a cul-de-sac. It was weird. I was like, does my yard actually touch the Wissahickon? But so, if you live, next to the Wissahickon or another forest, and you forest your yard, now you're not going to have wood thrush probably breeding in your yard, but the wood thrush that was farther back breeding, they might actually come closer because now you've made that shadier. You've made the edge. You've reduced the edge is now bulged out around your house, right? So you can actually impact wood thrush.
I think you need to be clear that what you're saying, that 4-acre territory is breeding territory, not migration.
Yes.
In migration, they can go through in, I would say, flocks or groups, but you can see a lot closer.
I have some slides coming up that illustrate that,
Okay,
right?
let me make sure
So
that-
we're talking about, right now, we're talking about breeding birds, talking about impacting breeding birds populations, trying to give resources for breeding birds, right? We're talking about, so you're not gonna probably have, chances you're gonna landscape your yard to get wood thrush breeding in there is slim to none. However, you might actually get wood thrush to come much closer to your yard. They might even forage a little bit in your yard if you change your yard to forest, because you're actually impacting where now you push the edge farther out, right? You're helping that patch be better quality habitat, right? So that's something to think about. Also, you see I mentioned leaf litter, so we'll circle back to that too, right? So here we go. Thank you, Bert. This is wood thrush territories. This is wood thrush site observations in the breeding season, right? So you can see that, and again, this is Northwest Philly because that's where I live, and that's, I want that kind of scale. And you can see that the wood thrush are not records for wood thrush in residential areas, pretty much at all. There's maybe, it looks like up in Wyncote area, there might in Lafayette Hill, there might be one or two in an area that's pretty, these are states that have a lot more forest to work with, so they might actually have wood thrush in their yard, but most, you're not seeing wood thrush in residential areas, right? Another species, but this is a canopy species, right? R.A.M.B.O, right? We know they're like mid-story, like upper, they're in the canopy or like maybe like down to like 15 feet and up, right? That's what they like. So I mentioned, you'll see a slide in a minute, the map. Now, this again, it's just during the breeding season. This is just during June and July records. And you can see that now you get this, species that like forages from like 20 feet and up the canopy. Now you see them in golf courses, in bigger yards, in manicured parks, right? You see red R.A.M.B.O are a lot wider, right? Because there's a lot more shade trees, there's a lot more canopy in residential areas in these manicured parks, right? So that's something to see there. So ovenbird, again, this is a species that feeds on the forest floor and gets up a little bit in the shrubs and sing. But again, it's really low down species, right? And again, even less than the with thrush. I have them near my house around the corner, but they really are restricted to areas where you have forest with structure and completely absent from residential areas, right? So, but okay, let's talk about a robin though. A tree and shrub nester, and you can see robins have a lot more habitat to work with. You will almost certainly get robins nesting in your yard if you have a shade tree, but robins actually nest a lot lower than a lot of people think. So they'll actually nest in shrubs too. So if you put shrubs in your yard, you're actually helping robins out too. So again, so robins, are birds. You can easily, they're a lot more comfortable in residential areas and a lot less picky with their habitat. In fact, they're the most observed species in North America as a robin, right? Catbird. So again, is a shrub nester. Now they like shrubs and they nest in shrubs and they like thick areas, but they don't need that. Unlike an ovenbird or a wood thrush, they don't need a closed canopy. They're okay with a more open canopy. And again, you can see how they're again in a lot more residential areas. Now, again, of course, you'll see the areas that are really dense, like row houses. You don't see them nearly as much in that as you do in areas a little bit bigger. In Philadelphia, you can see like down by where Linda lives, in the row houses of Lower Roxborough, you don't see them nearly as much. But it's funny, if you look in like areas of Germantown and an area that have similar housing types, but actually more the landscaping, even though you have a similar land to work with, the landscaping practices, people actually like trees a little bit more in Germantown in Mount Airy, even in the row house neighborhoods, and you get them a little bit more in there. We'll talk about where I'm from, Northeast Philly, in a minute, where they hate trees. And so mockingbird, again, this is more a savanna species. Again, you can see they don't really, they like more open, like they don't like the real thick stuff. They kind of like it a bit more open. So you can see that they are in residential areas, but not as densely as catbirds, right? Even if they're very closely related, you can see that the different habitat requirements make them that much less distributed, right? So this is thinking about differences. I thought this was interesting. I'm comparing Carolina wren to house wren in the breeding season. Now, we think about them, those species are very commonly together. They have very similar, house wren's a little bit smaller, but they eat same thing. They most of a lot of same food. They like to be in pretty similar habitats. But think about the difference is Carolina wren makes its own nest. Well, they might make a nest in the eaves of a house, or like they will just make their own nest in shrubs. But as we know, house wrens like to be in cavities, right? So this is Carolina wren's distribution in the breeding season, and then this is the house wren. Now it's not dramatic, but you can see that house wrens are. You can see there's way more Carolina wrens in row houses in more dense areas than house wrens because there's cavities, right? So this is a species now, not so much landscaping, but if you put up, bird houses, you can actually impact the house wren population. So I think about there. Song sparrow is another species that does pretty well on people, but it does want to nest in shrubs, but it doesn't need it's not a forest species, it's a forest edge species or like a savanna species, but likes like thickets, kind of like old growth, old field succession species, right? So again, you can see them in some more residential areas, but this is a species that if you plant shrubs in your yard, you will get song sparrows. That's a species that you can actually attract to your yard by your landscaping choices, right? You can work with the species habitat requirements in a residential setting, even in a row house, right? Now, this is an example of one of the most versatile species we have, northern cardinal, and look at like how they're distributed. But still, again, you can see the differences is they're there in the denser neighborhoods, but not as thick. So, you can impact them. So now we're talking about, it's funny, Northeast Philly. So I'm comparing, this is Northwest Philly, and Northwest Philly and Northeast Philly have some similarities in housing. Again, both, so closer to center city, the denser housing, the farther out to the suburbs, the less dense housing. And you have a lot of row houses, is more like row houses, then you get twins, and then you get single houses, kind of in that gradient, both in Northwest Philly and in Northeast Philly. But culturally, Northeast Philly, they hate trees. And so you look at Northeast Philly and you just can see that really only you get cardinals only in like Pennyback Park and some of the bigger parks but almost completely absent in residential areas. And this is actually small. This is a scale smaller because Northeast Philly is so big. It just shows you the differences in landscaping practices, right? And again, blue jay. Now this is even further reinforces that, right? They're not. Cardinals will nest slower. Blue jays really like to nest high up. So this is blue jays for the whole city, right? But then you'll see how absent they are from most of South Philly, most of North Philly, and then a lot of basically Northeast Philly outside of the parks. But let's zoom in. So this is a map of the tree canopy density in Philadelphia, right? And I thought it was striking. If you look at like blue jay sightings, and then the tree canopy density, it's really dramatic how it correlates, right? And you can see again, so Northeast Philly, the Philly's like a Y. So the two arms, that come, the two parts of the Y that go north, one's northwest or northeast. You can see one has a lot less tree canopy than the other, right? So again, I'm saying Northwest Philly, even though it has similar housing to Northeast Philly, the landscaping practices have way more trees. You can see that reflected in the tree canopy density map, and it's look how much more blue jay sightings you have in Mount Airy, Roxborough, Chestnut Hill, Germantown, East Falls compared to all of Northeast Philly. That's where I'm from. But I thought this was funny. So there's this blue jay sighting kind of in the row house area of Philly, like kind of in the middle. I was like, oh, what's that all about? And then you literally zoom in, and it's like for some reason these 14 blocks in Longcrest have more trees, and it's that dramatic. You have trees and you got blue jays. It's crazy how that goes. So here's another ecological concept, sink or source, right? So the idea is that just because you're seeing a species in an area doesn't mean the habitat is good enough quality that that species can actually be produced to maintain its own population, right? And the example I use is pileated woodpecker, because we see pileateds in other parks than just the Wissahickon Pennypack and bigger parks. And I know there are a bit in neighborhoods with big mature old trees, but pileateds we know they need big trees. They need big mature trees, right? So just because you're seeing pileateds somewhere does not mean that they're actually successfully breeding. What might be happening is that the Wissahickon is a very productive habitat for them, and they have an excess, right? So they're going to places, and you're seeing them in the residential areas, you're seeing them in other parks, but they might even be trying to breed. They might even breed occasionally, but remember, they have to replace themselves, and if they don't do that, the population, will shrink, right? So just think about that. Just because you're seeing something in your yard or in your area doesn't mean that they actually can persist there long term. They might just be overflow from an area good habitat. So, right. So here's pileated records, and right. So this is pileated records year round, and this is pileated records in the breeding season. So you can see that they, when it comes to breeding season, they're really restricted to where there's just really big trees, mostly just the Wissahickon and some of these, Schuylkill Center and some of these bigger, like Gladwin, these older neighborhoods with bigger trees, right? Very few records during outside the breeding season in residential areas, but look, in even smaller parks, right? Look, Aubrey Arboretum, doesn't have pileateds, during the breeding season, there's a record of them there. Fisher Park doesn't have, a lot of these places, but then you look during the rest of the year, and you can see, year round, you can see that they're out a lot more. So these are just things to consider, right? So this is all. I forgot to announce this whole section. Thanks, Bert. But those are breeding birds. So these are, the take home is properties adjacent to larger green spaces. You do have an opportunity to attract breeding birds, and you can, if you plant the right stuff and densely, you can actually push that out and actually help forest species. Forest interior species are very unlikely to nest in a yard that is not next adjacent to a forest. But installing shrubs in your yard, even if it's, farther from a park, you can attract these more edge species to your yard, like song sparrows and catbirds. And of course, tree nesting species will benefit from more street and yard trees, so think about it. All right, so about migrating birds is, so even if you live in a area not next to the park, you can actually provide some good habitat for migrating birds, because like Bert pointed out, they need different requirements and they're less choosy because they're moving, right? So you want to make sure that you're creating an oasis and not a trap, and maybe you can make it like a destination, right? But also there's a phenomenon, you might just be near some space and it might spill over. So we'll get into that. So we're doing a comparison here of my house, right? So this is my house. I live right next to the Yellow Trail. George Armistead and he bought a condo and I bought a house around the same time. Now George now is my neighbor, but we're comparing George Armistead's, and he bought his condo around the same time I bought my house, right? So this is my house right next to the Wissahickon, and I don't know if George wanted his exact condo's address, announced, but you can see this abandoned lot near 17th Street. George's condo kind of overlooked that, right? So, all right, I understand George is George. So obviously the observer plays a factor in this, but okay, George, here, and I'm no slouch, right? It ain't all George, right? It's some businesses have that, but George had a much bigger yard list in the same time from his house in South Philly than I did in my house, essentially next to the Wissahickon. Now you're like, what, doesn't make any sense? You're right, it's great habitat. But the thing is birds in, birds migrating over Philadelphia, and dawn hits and they're over my house, where there's the Wissahickon. There's a Schuylkill Center. There's spoils for choice. Birds migrating over to South Philly, that little patch of habitat is like gold. And they're just gonna, look at Great House Square, what Marty's seeing there, right? Imagine if Marty had, similar density, of black green space in South Philly, like George. Imagine if George or Marty had a yard. They didn't live in a condo, and Marty has a little space. But imagine if you actually had a backyard, you could plant some stuff in, put a water feature in. You might actually, so if you have potential to turn your house into a migrant, trap, provide some resources and actually get some, some birds coming to your property, more than you would think, in an area that's isolated, because the migrating birds, they need more resources, right? So that's, also with that said, speaking of, you're seeing birds.
It's like the Central Park effect.
Right. It's where, right near here. So, but also, but circling back to observing birds in your yard or from your yard, with George actually, even though he couldn't see the rivers themselves, he could see the airspace over both rivers. So that contributed as well, right? So he's able to see like ducks and things that I wasn't, right? And again, so I'm getting birds that are, I'm seeing some good stuff. I might get some spillover of those Wissahickon, some migrants, but again, I'm not getting the number of migrants he's getting. However, I am getting stuff like Horticulture owl, eastern creature, all the birds, not just in my airspace, in my yard, or, like in my trees in my yard, right? So he's not going to get in a condo. But the problem is George decided to be my neighbor. So now he lives a half mile from me. He already has a big yard list. He's George. He doesn't have a toddler, but he's on higher ground. So he actually has more view of the sky. He literally has he got Connecticut warbler as a flyover. He also has a sunroom, so he actually be inside and look up. He also does not have a toddler, but of course George is George. He lives there, so that's a factor. All right, so now we have some birds that breed here and migrate through, right? So I mean, not some of the birds, but think about parulas, right? They're kind of canopy foraging, right? So this is parulas in the breeding season. This is parulas outside of the breeding season. You can see that they're, they're a lot more in residential areas, right? This is in migrate. So Swainson's thrush, right? Again, so this is a bird that does not breed here, migrates through, but it's a species that likes shrubs, like dense forest, similar to habitat of a wood thrush, right? And you can see that they're not as spread out into the residential areas as a parula is, but they are more in residential areas than you would think, right? So even though they're a species that likes shrubs and likes more dense areas. So again, I'll finish up, circle back to Dacos in a minute. Red star, again, species more of a mid-story canopy species, right? Breeding season, mostly, a little bit in, Aubrey has them, some of these smaller parks has them, some arboretums, Morris cemeteries, but mostly in the Wissahickon. But during the migration, you see them a little bit residential areas, but you see way more, you see them in cemeteries and things like that, and during the migration. Very again, so a species thrush that likes to be on the ground, low shrubs. Breeding season really restricted to bigger parks, dense, but you can see them a lot more in residential areas during the migration. And put a warbler, right? They don't really breed here too. So I mean, they don't breed here apparently, unfortunately, but you can see that they are a shrub species. They like rhododendron thickets. They like to be a thick understory, but you will see them a bit in residential. They will use smaller parks as residential areas. In fact, Woodland Cemetery, the Woodland in West Philly, literally, they have like one patch of rhododendrons, and they'll be like a hooded warbler in there. They're that specific, but so. Black-throated green, again, more canopy foraging species, again, and you can see that there are a lot more, they're using residential areas a lot more. So the idea here is, like Bert mentioned, is that migrating birds, they will actually, they're less picky, right? For various reasons, they're migrating, less choices. They're shorter for a day, they really have to figure out where they're going, and utilize what they can, right? So, but also, so the point is, but even with that, you can see that even though the shrub foraging forest floor species are still a lot less use of residential areas compared to canopy species, which are a lot more likely to use residential areas. They still both will use residential areas more than they do during the breeding season. And so this is, so you can, even if you don't live right next to a park, you can actually impact these species by, obviously planting trees, they take a while. It's probably not going to be, a lot of us, let's face it, we plant a tree now, it's not going to be a canopy tree. It's not going to have a red V.O. in our lifetime, fortunately. But you plant a bunch of shrubs, you might have a hooded warbler. You might have a veery, a Swainson's thrush in your backyard in those shrubs, the next year. You can literally just get shrubs that are already full grown and just pack your yard full of them and actually get those species used in migration, right? So that's something to think about. And the problem is people don't like shrubs, and a lot of neighborhood associations, condos, but also like park practices. A lot of people say, oh, don't have shrubs. People will hide in there, do drugs. And so you got to impact your community and talk about the necessity of having, more structure to replicate what actual forest looks like, right? So, okay, we all know birds need food, structure, cover, water, right? But all those factor plants, if you think about it, right? All birds either eat, for food, all birds either eat plants or plants to convert it into protein in the form of insects or something that eats an insect. And birds have specific habitat requirements, and that is defined by vegetation type. Think about it. When we talk about habitats, we talk about, what's tundra? Well, it's treeless, it's lack of trees, but it's not just treeless. It's sedges and mosses and right. In desert, you're talking about lack of trees, but you have cactus. You're talking about prairies. It's grassland, literally grassland. Talking about the grass. But then when you talk about forest, obviously forest is a landscape dominated by trees, but we don't just talk about forest. We talk about, oak hickory forest, pine oak. We define habitat by the plants that are there. So, right. So, and then when birds are looking for cover, right, protection, they're generally they're most likely, especially our area, they're going to be inside a tree or shrub. Obviously maybe out west or something, they'll hide us rocks, but so all the things, all this stuff is plants, right? So kind of as a rule, if you think about it, like density and diversity are important. You want plant tissue becomes insects. You want more biomass. And if you think about it, go look at good quality forest habitat, you can't walk through it. It's dense, right? So try to think about it. If you want to, all things being equal, if you want to impact birds, just fill your yard full of shrubs as much as you'll tolerate. You won't see them, you'll hear them chipping back in there, but that's what they want. They want that biomass of shrubs, right? So that's the thing to do. It's up to you to decide what your yard looks like. But if you really want to help birds, pack your yard full of shrubs, right? Plant more shrubs. Can't say enough. So I was trying to look for a list of, I was talking to my colleagues. Unfortunately, we're in a really impacted area. And if you're doing an ecological restoration site, generally what you do is you go to an area that's in good condition and use that to refer back to like your habitat. But where you're going to go in the Piedmont or coastal plain, really, that is similar, to refer to what to put in your yard. But that's how it's usually done. You look at an area that's in good condition and try to replicate that in the land you work with. But there's some resources, these books, the plant communities of Pennsylvania and New Jersey. This shows you what should be here. So you can start looking at these, thinking about what plants you might want to put in your yard. These are two great books. Talk about specifically what plants and what structure, especially the Restoring North American birds was. So refer back to these. Again, so food, birds consume insects as part of their diet. They all songbirds eat insects at least during the breeding season, right? So even birds can be feeder, they're feeding young insects, they're eating a lot of insects themselves. So it's really important to provide actual bird food, and native plants, right, are bird food. Now, I'm not strict about natives, but all things being equal, native plants host more insects because they shared an evolutionary history with insects, and plants put poison in their plant tissue to stop insects from eating them. So if an insect in a plant did not share evolutionary history, they probably can't eat it. So native plants, it's been shown time and time again, they actually have more biomass, right? But some birds do. The other parts, the seeds they eat, most birds don't eat leaves other than like geese eating grass. We don't have mouse birds here, but birds eat berries. So yeah, I think if you want to put berries for birds, you got to think about the timing of this berry. Think about when those plants are in fruit and when the birds are around, right? Circle back to that. So if your plant material in your yard doesn't look like this, it's not holes in it, then insects aren't eating it, and therefore it's not useful to birds, right? This is from my own research study in grad school. I was looking at shrubs, and this just shows you that in both insect abundance and insect diversity, native shrubs had 2 or 3 times more than alien shrubs. So this shows you the importance of not just shrubs, but the species of it. So just giving you some, it's almost, what is it now, almost a 9? So I should probably be wrapping up, and we wrap up at 9, Emily, or 9:30?
Generally 9.
Cool. So someone's gonna blow through this real quick. Black cherry is a good tree. Below is great for rusty blackbirds, right? Red cedar is a good tree. Ash, but so breeding birds, obviously breeding birds are trying to feed insects, but so there are some birds that do eat fruit in the summer, but most of our plants don't produce fruit in the spring. So but here's basically thrushes are the main thing we're thinking of as frugivores, right? So then we want to, so I made a whole list based on plants of Pennsylvania, showing you, and used some information from my naturalists, basically showing you what's in highlighted is showing you what is really good species of, and I provided this list of really good, basically viburnums are really great, chokeberries. These are crab apples, and poison ivy is good, sumacs, dogwoods, basically some hollies, lots of viburnums. These are things, elderberry, these are species that are actually shrubs are producing fruit when thrushes are migrating, right? So something to think about. But speaking of gray-cheeked bicknells, pokeweed pokeweed will find you, just don't cut it down. Pokeweed loves its berries, right? There's some good bird attracting woodies. People love hummingbirds. These are some species. This is going to be available so people can, look at this on their own. But I have information about what are features birds probably know about this. Again, I was just talking about the forest layers and some trees, some understory trees that might be good for these, eye level and like 20 feet up species. Again, some really good shrubs. Again, so obviously there's also herbaceous plants on the forest floor, but don't remove your leaves because things like the foraging leaves, there's insects in there. Leave your dead logs. This is my yard, and I actually left. This is a spruce that died, was dead before we got to the house, and we left the spruce. Basically, we figured out how far it would be. If it would fall our house or our neighbor, we just took off that and it left the rest, right? So it's no longer a danger. Had an arborist do it. So brush piles are good if you provide cover, but nothing's better than actual shrubs, right? But we all know Wrens love shrubs. Succession, this is, when an area is cleared for whatever reason, plants tend to grow back in a specific order. And a lot of species like that, different stages of that. So your job is to kind of replicate that because these species really like that kind of habitat, and you kind of got to replicate that, 3 to 10 year age of an old field to get your indigo buntings, brown thrashers, field sparrow, right? It's something to think about. So I'm going to hit grass on this quickly, but saying if you want to bring unusual birds to your yard, what do you do? You think rare birds are rare because they're not supposed to be here. They're somewhere else. So you might want to provide something that they is familiar to them, right? obviously if you're in a desert, have water, right? Think about opposites, right? Grassland birds are unusual out here, but we usually don't have the habitat area to track them. But think about that. If out west, often it's warblers go to find that little oasis, little canyon full of trees. Think about that, right? Generally that's the scale, but so birds that are off track are going to look something familiar. So boreal forest species, they're going to either want. Sometimes we actually plant boreal forest species a little bit south of the range, right? Some of these spruces and birches, whatnot, sugar maples. But sometimes you actually have something that like grows here, but so we all know that like river birch will attract your is local, but it'll attract your redpolls. Hemlocks will attract some and will attract some of your crossbills, and red and silver maples will get sapsuckers and whatnot, in it. So some of these things you give them either an analog to what they might be looking for, right? But sometimes you have something in your yard already that there's no need to cut it out if it's not going to be invasive, right? So Atlas cedar or magnolias, ginkgo, sapsuckers love that. White mulberry is invasive, but man, it produces berries that in their fruit right now, birds love them. Japanese black pine. Remember Seven Presidents Park where the full crossbills is in like was it 5-10 years ago? We all went and got white wing and red crossbill. They love Japanese black pine. Chinese elm, the magic tree at Lily Lake, right? In Cape May. That's a Chinese elm that gets aphid infestations. This species regularly gets aphid infestations. So if you have one, keep it because it's non-invasive and it gets aphid infestations and birds love it. Insectivores eat it up. Again, in your like Norway blue spruce, your paper birch, they're not native here, but they're not invasive, but they attract your boreal species, right? So I'll just say here, you don't have grasslands, you don't have the acreage to work with to actually attract grassland birds, right? Meadowlark, they're only at the airport. Unless you have the airport to work with, you're not going to get meadowlarks in your yard, right? So, but you know what? Meadows are cool, they're fun. They might attract some seed heads and goldfinches or whatnot, but they're generally for you and butterflies and other things, not the birds, but they're cool. And I have met in my yard. It's fun. It's fun. This is my daughter when she was 1. She loved it. But also, okay, tell people who managing land for grasslands, stop planting trees. We have Dixon Meadow. I love it to death. Why are they planting trees there? Why? Grassland birds and marsh birds don't want trees because they're going to get jumped by Cooper's hawk. So if you put even one tree there, you've now reduced the habitat they'll nest in for sure, and they don't even want to stop their migration. So if you're looking for grassland birds, stop planting trees if that's what you're looking for, right? But what you could do, like I said before, is if you live next to a grassland, well, make more grass in the yard. You live next to an airport, a golf course, or agricultural fields. Well, you already have that open area. Lean into it, and you can affect it that way. This is aesthetics. Put a path through it. You won't really serve a canopy. It looks nice. If you want it to look nice, I don't care if it looks nice. My wife does, so I have to compromise. But also, sometimes it's like putting a bunch of plants densely in the middle here. There looks nice. Kind of keeps there's some aesthetic value there, but that's the bird's nest in it. Some aesthetic. So the ways to get habitat that looks nicer. Also, no, this is examples. My yard's really hard to photograph because it's on a really steep hill, so it's hard. I have like one side of my backyard is forest, is like spruces and then like shrubs, and the other side is this like 20 by 25 by 25 meadow in full sun. So, and with like a grass in the middle of it. So it was really hard to photograph. But yeah, so one thing you could do is like plant like lower growing species, and then like forbs and some shrubs, and then your trees kind of like has like kind of like step thing going. That's aesthetically pleasing. Ways to kind of sneak in good habitat. This looks nice. This is we all know this. But one thing we want to talk about real quick is housing. HOAs, municipal townships, right? You got to get. Sometimes people will find you. Your neighbors will tattletale on you, right? And especially in the suburbs, right? It's really, when this happens in Philly, it happens to sometimes friends of mine. There's an agency that'll come out and you'll get a warning first, and then they'll come out, and then you'll be like, no, this is native plants. I intentionally did this, and they're like, oh, you're good, right? But that's in Philly. We literally plant stormwater management. Like we plant the same plants. The water department plants these plants, so you can just be like, the water department's doing it. Why can't I? And it'll leave you alone. And it will do that in Philadelphia, but in the suburbs, this is a barrier to landscaping your yard for wildlife. So you gotta like do some of those aesthetic tips I talked about to kind of make it look nicer to your neighbors, but also get involved in your local HOA and your local municipal government and really try to affect that change. And again, if you live in an apartment, you live, talk to your condo association, talk to the apartment building. And also if there's a local park, say, hey, why not put some shrubs in and explain why, right? Again, so Philly has this Green City Clean Waters where we're trying to like reduce the amount of stormwater because we have combined sewer. It's a whole thing. Trying to slow down stormwater so it doesn't overwhelm our sewer system and discharge sewage. So we're trying to plant more plants. So hey, look at Philly. This is good for stormwater. These native plants, they're not just for birds, but they actually benefit, our stormwater management. So use that as an example, right? Just resources. Native Pennsylvania Plant Society is your ally. But here's a couple. In New York Times article about how they got rid of their lawn and they successfully won against their HOA. This is something to think about. Just local resources where you get the native plants. The photo, if it's an unattributed photo, this is my thank yous. If it's an unattributed photo and it looks good, George took it. If it's an unattributed photo and it's bad, I took it. And otherwise, I got it from someone else and I cited it. But thank you so much. Happy to entertain questions, or we can end quick and hit the bar. Let me know.